I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to speculate about what was running through your mind while I was baptizing Dylan. I'd be willing to bet you were thinking, I think Dylan might baptize Frank. And if I were going to be honest, I thought the same thing. All right, let's do this. Anyhow, it is really good to see you guys this morning. We are going to be wrapping up our series, Being and Making Disciples, this week. And I want to begin by sharing a quote that I stumbled across this week that I just had to share with you. The quote goes like this: if you can get people asking the wrong questions, the answers don't matter. Now, think about the kinds of questions that we typically throw around, the kind of questions that take priority in our lives. What are we having for dinner? Where are we going on vacation? What time is kids' baseball game or soccer game or whatever your kid's into? All right, these kinds of questions, they have their value, but at the end of the day, these kinds of questions probably don't have the eternal value that other questions might have. So for the last 6 weeks, we've been trying to be a little bit better about asking a different set of questions that will help us be and make disciples. Questions like, who am I really? How do I grow as a disciple of Jesus naturally? What is God teaching me personally? Am I in rhythm spiritually? Am I in balance relationally? And finally, last week we asked the question, who is God preparing for me presently? All right, the aim of the question that we asked last week's tool was to help us develop a spirit of sensitivity as disciples that mirrors the mindset that Jesus walked around with. All right, we want to recognize the people that God is at work on behind the scenes. We said that Jesus was constantly meeting people who were nothing like him and sharing the good news about the arrival of God's kingdom with them. And we said our takeaway from last week was, in spite of our faults, in spite of our hangups, God will use anyone who's willing to show up and speak up, because we've all been called to go and make disciples. When we're willing to ask the question, who is God preparing for me presently? We are stepping into God's plan of redemption and reconciliation. And it starts with noticing those who are already around us. Who's been hospitable and kind to me? Is there a friend or a coworker that just can't get enough of spending time with me? Or is there someone in my orbit who's asking good questions about life and faith? Or is there somebody who I know is going through a really rough season or a tough situation, who may be more open to me and the gospel than they have ever been in their lives? Asking this diagnostic question, again, is about developing a spirit of sensitivity and pinpointing where God is at work ahead of us. Today we're going to wrap up our series, Being and Making Disciples, by exploring one final question. And it has to do with multiplication. Right? How do we multiply ourselves into the life of someone that we are discipling? We're going to ask the question today, who am I investing in intentionally? Now, remember, way back in week number 1, we said that disciple is the Greek word mathetes, and it just means a learner or a student. And again, way back in week number 1, we said that Jesus' words in Matthew 4 lay out what a disciple is. In Matthew chapter 4, verse 19, Jesus said, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Right? And if you'll recall, first we said that a disciple is someone who is following Jesus. And then we said a disciple is someone being changed by Jesus. Finally, we said a disciple is someone who is committed to the mission of Jesus. And basically, what we see in the Gospels is Jesus inviting people to follow him. And as they do, he teaches them and trains them to do the kinds of things that he'd already been doing. Jesus' model for training his disciples is unveiled in the gospel in basically 4 stages. And we're going to look at Mark's gospel, Mark's take on the life of Jesus, as we unpack these 4 stages of discipleship. In the first stage, Jesus did all the heavy lifting while the disciples were basically spectators. They got to watch. Right? Mark chapter 1 opens with Jesus calling his first followers, beginning in verse 16. And then almost immediately, they go to the town of Capernaum, where Jesus started teaching. But remember, Jesus taught in a way that was wholly different than other religious leaders. Right? Check out what Mark says in Mark chapter 1, verse 22. He says, the people were amazed at his, talking about Jesus, at his teaching, because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. Right? Jesus wasn't like the teachers of the law. He wasn't like the Pharisees. Mark says he taught as one who had authority. His understanding and command of the scriptures was as clear to them as the nose on my face. Not only that, Jesus backed up his powerful message by performing all kinds of miracles and wondrous acts. Look at what happens right after this. Verse 23. Just then, a man in their synagogue who was possessed by an impure spirit cried out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." All right, so even evil spirits recognize who Jesus is and the authority that he has. Verse 25, "Be quiet," said Jesus sternly. "Come out of him." The impure spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. The people were all so amazed that they asked each other, "What is this? A new teaching and with authority." He even gives orders to impure spirits and they obey him. News about him spread quickly all over the whole region of Galilee. So, from day number 1, it was clear that Jesus wasn't like other teachers. And from there, while still in stage number 1, Jesus and the disciples, they traveled to Peter's house, right, where Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law. Right? And from there, Mark goes on to tell us this in verse 32. He says, that evening, after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many of various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. All right, the point is, in stage 1 of Jesus' discipleship model, the rabbi did all the work, and the disciples, they were spectating, they were watching, they were taking it in. All right, these guys, let's be honest, they didn't have any experience when it came to healing anybody or driving out demons. All right, for the most part, they were just a bunch of fishermen. Jesus is the one setting the agenda. He's the one casting the vision, and the disciples in stage number 1, they soak it all in. Think of the disciples in stage 1 like they're spiritual infants. All right, they can't feed themselves. They can't provide for their own needs. Like newborn babies, they are totally dependent on their teacher. But anyone with kids will tell you, babies can't stay babies forever. Right? As much as we like them, they're cute and they're cuddly and, they won't get all sassy with us. We know it's not healthy for babies to stay babies forever. The author of Hebrews, he chides those who refuse to move out of stage number 1. He says, by now, you should have been teachers, but once again, you need to be taught the simplest things about what God has said. You need milk instead of solid food. People who live on milk are like babies who don't really know what is right. Solid food is for the mature people who've been trained to know right from wrong. We've said that Jesus grows our faith naturally through invitation to experience his grace and the challenge to accept what he says is true about us, as well as what's true about the world around us. And stage 1 is heavy on invitation. Stage 1 is heavy on come and see, come hang out, come check things out. But as we get into stage number 2, because we have to go to stage number 2, because we can't stay in stage number 1, Jesus starts to ramp up the challenge. Flash forward just a few chapters to Mark chapter 6. In Mark chapter 6, lots and lots of really important discipleship training happens. Right, the chapter opens with Jesus facing resistance and hostility in his hometown. Right, and that experience for Jesus is a reminder for us that resistance and hostility are realities of following Jesus. Right? It isn't always easy. In fact, obedience to Jesus is very, very hard. Right? And disciples need to be prepared to experience rejection and disappointment themselves. Following this resistance, in Mark chapter 6, Jesus immediately sends out the 12 in pairs to preach in various towns ahead of his arrival. Right? And he commands them to do the kind of things that he has already been doing himself. Check it out. It says this in verse 12. They went out and preached that people should repent. They drove out many demons and anointed many sick people with oil and healed them. Right? This, what we're seeing here in Mark chapter 6, verses 12 and 13, is exactly what we saw Jesus doing in the opening chapter or two of Mark's gospel. But in stage number 2, there are setbacks. Right? In stage number 2, there are wins and there are also losses. Right? In the opening chapter, in the opening part of chapter 6, the disciples look just like Jesus. Right? Based off 12 and 13, they look just like Jesus. They were doing all the things that he was doing. But when they return to their rabbi to debrief, to explain all the incredible things that they'd seen and the wonderful things that they'd experienced, there's a little bit of a wrench thrown into the whole deal. Right? A giant crowd of people show up to hear from Jesus, to learn a little bit more about him and the gospel that he's been preaching. And as we've said several times throughout the series, Jesus is compassionate, and he looked on the crowds like sheep without a shepherd. And so what did he do? He decided to teach them. Thing is, after a while, it started to get late. And the disciples, they just wanted to send the people away. Again, put yourself in their flip-flops, right? Think about it. They had been doing kingdom work for weeks, right? And by this time, they're home, and they just kind of want to relax. They want to recuperate. They want to spend time with Jesus. Verse 36, send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and the villages and buy themselves something to eat. Thing is, in stage 2, there are wins and there are losses. There are successes and there are setbacks. It's a part of the whole shebang. This stage is challenging, and this is the moment in time where the disciples, they stop looking as much like Jesus as they had a few verses earlier. Right, this is what they say in verse 37. They say, Jesus says to them, hey, you want to send the folks away? That's not a great idea. You give them something to eat. All right, their response, send the people into the towns so they can get some food. We can have a little bit of a break. They don't sound a whole lot like Jesus. And Jesus says, okay, I've got something for you. I've got a little bit of challenge. You give them something to eat. This is tough stuff. This is a big ask. There are thousands and thousands of people there. All right, this is a very tall order coming from Jesus. And like many of us, when we enter into this stage, in stage 2 of our discipleship, into our apprenticeship of Jesus, the challenge is something that we kind of push back from. We recoil at just a little bit. This is how they responded. They said to him, that would take, buying all these people food, that would take more than a half year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat? Now, don't miss this. Discipleship to Jesus isn't always linear. Right? Discipleship to Jesus isn't always linear. In fact, it's I would suggest to you this morning that it's circular. Right? Like Sometimes there are successes, and then sometimes there are setbacks. And then there are successes, and then there are setbacks. Successes and setbacks. And when we're kind of in this loop, successes and setbacks, it's really important that we continue to use one of the tools that we, pulled out of our little toolbox in the first couple weeks. Whether we're having successes or setbacks, it is absolutely imperative to continue to ask the question, what is God teaching me? Sometimes in the successes, it can be easy to overlook this question, right? Because things are going well. But why are they going well? And in the setbacks, it can be easy to say, I'm not cut out for this, or I'm terrible, or I'm a failure, or God must really hate me. But is that what really, what God is saying to us in those moments? What is God saying to us in our successes as well as in our setbacks? Think about this. Because, discipleship to Jesus is not linear, because it's circular, it's kind of like a loop. We have to ask good questions. Think about the craziness of what we're reading today, right? These are the same guys who had just come back from working miracles just like Jesus. They've been healing the sick and casting out demons, and is in this very same chapter. Yet now they seem overwhelmed by dinner. You tracking with me? Thing is, this ebb and flow of effectiveness that we see in Mark chapter 6 serves as an important lesson for us, right? In stage number 2, right? In stage number 2, the rabbi, the teacher, he still does the work, but he allows us to help. All right, we're not ready to go out and be left on our own. The teacher, he's still there, and he's still calling the shots. He's still setting the direction. He's still casting the vision. A good rabbi will have a disciple lead beyond their ability at times, but in stage 2, they're still assistants, and they're still working through their shortcomings, right? The limitations that they have are becoming more and more apparent to them all the time. Again, think a good coach is going to insist that his players, push a little further than they're comfortable with, right? They're going to push a little harder than what they think they can do, whether you're running or playing baseball or basketball or whatever. Like a good parent, you're going to push your kids a little further than what they would maybe typically feel comfortable going. And a good teacher is going to do the same thing. He's going to give them leadership opportunities a little bit ahead of where they're comfortable, but it's for their good. But he's still there. The teacher is still there. The coach is still there. Look what happens. Verse 38. How many loaves do you have? He asked. Go and see. When they found out, they said, 5 loaves, 2 fish. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. All right, you picking up what I'm putting down? Jesus directs the disciples to have the people sit down. He gives them information to pass along. Verse 40, so they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of men who had eaten was 5,000. Now, in this passage, traditionally, we'll come to this passage, and there's lessons to learn here about faith and about provision. But for the purposes of what we're talking about today, I want to focus your attention on what we see in stage number 2 of Jesus' model for multiplication, his model for discipleship. Right? Jesus is still doing the work, but now he's challenging his disciples to get off the sideline and allowing them to assist in things like distributing the food and collecting the leftovers. Right? They're no longer just passively watching. They're in the thick of ministry, and they're going to make mistakes. Right? That's okay. That's a part of discipleship. This is perhaps the most important stage in the entire process because, the excitement has kind of died down and the disappointments are starting to pile up. All right, this is a stage where lots and lots of people, they throw in the towel because they're convinced that they don't measure up and they never will. I almost threw in the towel just 2 months into my first ministry. In context, I had plans, right? Specifically, I had plans to take my youth group to Kings Island because that's what you do, right? You're going to go out, you're going to have fun, you're going to look cool, kids are going to like you. So I had plans to go to Kings Island. Plans is the operative word. See, here's the deal. I was 22 years old at the time, and I was fresh out of college. And that particular season, I had just finished up a week of church camp, right? And Friday afternoon, we're packing up, we're pulling out of camp, and my intention, my hope is that, we're going to head home, and the next morning, we're just going to pack up in the van again and head out to Cincinnati. Again, I use the word hope because it's accurate. You see, my senior minister at the time, he canceled the trip. All right, I'm sitting there in the passenger seat, and he's driving, the 15-passenger van on our way home from camp, and he leans over and he says, hey, Frank, about your Kings Island trip, you can't go. And I'm like, well, can't go? Well, what do you mean can't go? And he said, you haven't shared any of the details with the kids' parents. You haven't communicated when you're leaving or when you're expecting to be home. You haven't collected any money or handed out any permission slips to be signed. Right? You have to understand that you're taking people's kids to another state. Right? And I can't, in good conscience, send you off with my kids knowing as little about this activity as I do. And I got to be honest, my first response was I was mad. In my mind, I'm like, bro, who you don't even know me. And then it dawned on me, I'm like, oh yeah, you don't, I've been here for 2 months. You don't even know me. And I don't know you all very well, right? And then I started asking some questions what would I do if a kid got hurt on this trip? Or what would I do if, a kid gets on a roller coaster after eating, a bucket full of French fries and then he's sick for the rest of the day? I say he because, a girl wouldn't do that. But what would I do in that situation? And then I was at the place where I really started to second guess and doubt myself. How could I have overlooked something so basic, right? How could I be so foolish? And the thing is, Brian, my senior minister at the time, at the end of the day, that dude was really just looking out for me, right? I was a college kid, and I was thinking that I could treat my youth group like my peers, right? Like other college students who knew the right questions to ask and had disposable income and could just go and, come and go as they pleased. And what Brian was doing, he was like, you kind of need to see things from a dad's perspective, not a big brother or a friend. Right? Brian wasn't trying to sabotage me. He was protecting me from my ignorance and my inexperience. That's what good teachers do. And Jesus' example in Mark chapter 6 is a reminder that ministry isn't all about us. And the results aren't all up to us. We have a good God who provides when we ask, right? He'll provide for the needs that we have when we ask. And as disciples, if we can push past our inexperience and our ignorance, if we can stick it out through our setbacks, that happen in stage number 2 of our discipleship to Jesus, by the time we get to stage number 3, there will be breakthrough for us. Breakthrough is waiting on the other side of stage 2 if we can stick it out. Stage 3 of Jesus' model, the teacher kind of takes his hands off the wheel because he's no longer driving. Right? Instead, it's as if he's handed the keys over to the disciple and he's moved over into the passenger seat. And in essence, he's saying, look, I'll co-pilot. I'm going to let you take the controls.
and I'll help when you need it. All right, there's a great example of this. A few chapters later in Mark chapter 9. This is stage number 3. And in stage number 3, Mark chapter 9, Jesus, Peter, James, and John, they are all coming down from the Mount of Transfiguration to meet up with the other disciples. Mark tells us that as they approached, there was some kind of commotion going on between the teachers of the law, the other disciples, and a swelling crowd of onlookers. And as Jesus approached, he asked, "What are you arguing with them about?" Verse 17. A man from the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought you my son who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech." Now, let's pause real quick. Let's not move on. Who did this guy bring his son to? Don't miss what's just happened. Like Jesus, Peter, James, and John, they just come off a mountain. This guy didn't bring his sick kid to Jesus. Pay attention to who he's brought his kid to. Verse 18, whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not. Now, just make a quick observation here. This guy isn't making a distinction between Jesus and his disciples. He sees Jesus' disciples as an extension of Jesus. Right? I brought you my son. And I'm just going to tell you, the world around us, they're not going to make a distinction either. We are disciples of Jesus. When we choose to live otherwise, they're not going to make the distinction. They're just going to say, that whole Jesus thing is probably a little bit of a sham. Look at how Jesus' followers behave. Look how look what's important to them. Whenever it seizes him, at verse 18, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not. Again, this is stage number 3. All right, after a brief exchange with the boy's father about the severity of the kid's condition, Jesus again highlights the power available to God's people through faith. Mark says, when Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the impure spirit. You deaf and mute spirit, he said, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, he's dead. But Jesus took him by the hand, lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. After Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, why couldn't we drive it out? He replied, this kind can only come out by prayer. All right, this scene, this whole thing that we're seeing in Mark chapter 9 is a perfect example of what life looks like in stage 3 of our apprenticeship to Jesus. Right here, the disciples, they're more confident, right? They feel more capable because of all the time they'd spent with their teacher, with their rabbi. But the reality is they're still not quite ready to be totally independent of the rabbi just yet. They still have a bit more to learn, and the rabbi is still there to help. He's still there to coach. He's still there to keep, the car on the road and out of the ditch so that they don't get discouraged and fall backwards into stage number 2. One year, right before church camp, so summertime, right before church camp, I was meeting with Chris Tanner. And Chris is the youth minister at Georgetown for many years. He actually married Amanda and me. And we're sitting there and at this restaurant in Georgetown, this Mexican restaurant. And I'm kind of bummed, if I'm going to be totally honest. We're both in student ministry at the time, and it's the week before camp, and we only had like 22 or 23 kids signed up. And I was, maybe believe it or not, like I was actually at this time in ministry, I was actually communicating pretty well with the parents, right? They kind of knew what was going on. Lots of planning had actually gone into the week. And so, I'm looking at the number of kids that are registered, and I'm their apparent lack of interest and enthusiasm just had me feeling a little bit discouraged. And the thing is, Chris is a few years ahead of me as far as ministry is concerned. And I just remember him, there at the Mexican restaurant, sitting across the table, looking at me, and he said, hey, like, so what? Right, so what if only 23 kids sign up? Heck, like, if only 23 kids sign up, that might just mean, like, fewer headaches and fewer, troublemakers that we have to deal with. And here's the deal, like, honestly, like, I knew that up here, right? I understand that it's not about the number of people who show up to your thing. It's really more about, like, the heart posture of the people who do show up, right? But the deal is, like, sometimes when you're in the thick of ministry and you're in the thick of making disciples, it can be easy to overlook what you know to be true up here. You follow me? And the teacher, like a good teacher, a good rabbi, a good mentor, isn't necessarily there to do the work for you in stage number 3. They're there to support you and help you remember the things that you probably already know. At this point, the student and the teacher have become more like friends, right? Which is reminiscent of what we see in John chapter 15, where Jesus says, I no longer call you servants because a servant doesn't know his master's business. Instead, I've called you friends, for everything that I've learned from my Father, I've made known to you. Stage 3, we need ministry mentors to help us remember the things that are easy to kind of overlook when we're in the thick of discipleship or when we're in the throes of ministry. And by stage number 4, the disciples ready to go off and make more disciples. At his ascension in Mark chapter 16, Jesus said to his disciples, go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. Think about what these guys had experienced, right? These guys had followed Jesus around for more than 3 years. They'd heard him teach and work wonders. Then they'd started teaching and working wonders themselves. And if that wasn't enough, they'd seen their rabbi, their close friend, crucified, and then he rose from the dead 3 days later. These guys were ready to lead. They'd seen it all. Sure, they'd experienced setbacks along the way, but they had a good rabbi, they had a good teacher. Jesus had been there to help them turn their setbacks into comebacks. Right? Jesus' disciples, they'd seen it all, and their enthusiasm was through the roof. It was peaked. And they'd arrived at stage number 4, and Jesus said, look, fellas, I'm out of here. You got this. His disciples' identity had been established. It was solid and it was sure. Right? They were in Christ and Christ was in them. They understood how to grow others because they knew how Jesus had grown them, right? Through invitation and challenge. Jesus modeled for them what it looked like to hear from God and then walk in obedience, to live in spiritual rhythm, right? To a spiritual rhythm where you work, from your rest, not working for your rest. He also modeled what it looked like to live in relational balance, right? Up with the Father, in with those you're doing ministry with, and out with a world that's desperate and hurting and in need. And whether they were anything like him or not, Jesus exemplified what it looked like to be sensitive to people that God was working on ahead of him so that he could share the good news about the arrival of his kingdom with them. And finally, Jesus multiplied himself and his disciples so that they could go and do the same. This is what it looks like to be and make disciples. And we've all been called to participate in that good work. In his final letter to Timothy, Paul lays out his biblical strategy for discipleship, saying this. This is 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1. You then, my son, talking to Timothy, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus, and the things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable people who will also be qualified to teach others. Think about this passage in like generational terms. All right, there are at least 4 generations of disciples alluded to in this passage if we begin with the fact that Jesus first discipled Paul. Right? Jesus invested in Paul, then Paul discipled Timothy. Timothy in turn discipled faithful men right there where he was living. And then finally those faithful men were expected to go mentor others. This passage reflects who we want to become as a church family. And the only way that we become this as a church family is if we start to take seriously this call to go and make disciples as individuals. Discipleship is about allowing Jesus to make us into something new, to change us from the inside out. And the question I just kind of want to leave you with this morning is, are we allowing him to do that? And if so, then what stage of discipleship are we in? Are we in stage number 1 where, we're in the fold, but we're still kind of watching and sitting on the sidelines? If so, just remember, you can't stay there forever. You can't stay in stage number 1. You got to mature. Maybe you're in stage number 2 where, you're following Jesus, but you're recognizing that it's hard and there are setbacks, and you just need somebody that can speak into your life to help remind you that, yes, there might be setbacks, but there's going to be a lot of successes, and somebody that can help turn your setbacks into comebacks. Maybe that's where you are. Maybe you're in stage number 3 where, you're in the thick of ministry and you're making disciples, but you might maybe need a little bit of help still. Right? Like you're coming across things that you don't know how to deal with, and you want to be faithful. Maybe you're in stage number 4 and you are making disciples, you're humming along, and you just need people to celebrate what's going on. Guys, there is nothing more important in the world than making disciples for Jesus and growing his kingdom. Nothing is more important than that. And if you're doing it alone, or you're doing it in a vacuum, or you're doing it to silence, then we are doing it wrong. It's the most important thing, and we should be celebrating when that happens. So what stage in your apprenticeship to Jesus are you in? That's a question I really want you to be thinking about as we wrap things up. I want to close this morning by showing you a picture of what I think discipleship looks like. Right? We've said that Jesus multiplied himself and his followers so that they could turn around and do the same thing, do the things that he'd been doing. That's the call that's placed on all of our lives, not just ministers, not just elders, not just deacons. Everyone who claims to be a follower of Jesus is called to go and make disciples. And so I hope that this series has kind of spurred you a little bit, maybe inspired you to become a disciple for the first time or start making disciples because you haven't been. So what I want to do is I want to watch a quick video. We're going to sing one last song. And if you need to take some kind of a step today, maybe you need to become a follower of Jesus for the very first time, I'll be right up here and I'd love to talk to you about what that might look like. Maybe you need to take a step and say, hey, you guys seem crazy. I'm crazy too. I would like to be crazy with you. Can I be a part of your family? I would love to talk with you about that too. Maybe you're feeling the desire to start making disciples, but you're not sure exactly where to get started and you want a little bit of help. I'll be right there. I want you to watch this video. We're going to sing a song, and if you need to meet me right there, I will be right there. Check out this video. Have you gotten a video of your attire yet?
No.
Keegan Livers, Rap Magic, Mr. Aqua B. A $38 outfit right there, folks.
And I had 75% of it.
Go big or go home.
Look at how green that grass is over there. Would you like to take a video of me jumping in?
You're going to jump into this water?
I will jump into this water.
Keegan is going to jump into the pool.
There you go.
How could I resist?
Oh, you straight went. So. Let's go. You're very good. And it's so good to know that you're going to bring one towel.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, the tour. The tour.
Are you gonna catch hypothermia?
Maybe so, but it's working.